So can these types of complex features really be ascribed to Joseph Smith's creative literary talent in 1829? Daniel C. Peterson thinks not. The intricate structure and detailed complexity of the Book of Mormon, he argues, seems far better explained as the work of several ancient writers using various written sources over the space of centuries than exploding suddenly from the mind of a barely educated manual laborer on the American frontier. Mormonism with the Mirth, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in the last episode, we had a look at the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, both the witnesses of the gold plates and also of the translation and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. We had a look at their testimonies, and particularly the testimony of the 3 and the 8 witnesses, as well as unofficial witnesses who claim to either have a visionary experience or to see and hold the plates in a natural way. And we also addressed some of the critical quotes from people like Stephen Burnett and others, and gave some apologetic responses to that. And our conclusion was that the witnesses of both the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and of the gold plates seem to support the divine authenticity and divine origin of the Book of Mormon, the translation, and the gold plates. And it's really up to us whether or not we view their testimonies as credible and reliable. But they seem very much sure that they saw the angel, they saw the plates, and that the book coming forth of the Book of Mormon was of divine origin. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at, could Joseph Smith have naturally produced and orally dictated the Book of Mormon? We're going to be looking at Book of Mormon complexity. We're going to have a look at, is there any ancient elements in the Book of Mormon, any ancient Hebrew literary writing elements, such as Chiasmus and Hebraisms, supporting this being of ancient origin. We're going to also have a look at Joseph Smith's education, his intellect, and how well could he have known the Bible? And really, if Joseph Smith had the skills naturalistically to produce the Book of Mormon, I would recommend listeners to go back and watch my interview with Brian Hales, as he lays out in a lot more depth sort of the case for the Book of Mormon and just how long and complex it would be for Joseph Smith to have produced this himself. I'm really sort of tagging along this episode. In the next episode, we'll be looking at the naturalistic explanations or authorship theories for the Book of Mormon, and it does sort of go hand in hand with this one, but part 1 will be focusing primarily on complexity and could Joseph Smith have orally dictated it himself. And unfortunately, this will be a long episode. There's a lot of information. There's going to be a lot of slides. I'm going to try to go through it as condensed as I can, but bear with me. This will be a long one. Sorry. But there's so much information to get through, so we just need to dive in and do it. Okay, so let's begin with the dictation, mechanics, the time frame for coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So some facts about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. This comes from Brian Hales' article. It was dictated, 588 pages to a scribe, so it's about 270,000 words. And according to scholar Jack Welch, the maximum days was 85 days, and it could have been as low as 57 days. So most scholars would say somewhere in between maybe 57 to 74 working days for the dictation of the Book of Mormon, which would be an average of 8 to 10 pages dictated per day, taking maybe around 3 or 4 hours, possibly longer as well, because I know it's described as long days of Oliver Cowdery when Joseph Smith was dictating and translating. According to Scousman's work on the original manuscript, Joseph dictated 20 to 30 words at a time. The scribe would read it back to ensure accuracy. There were no books, manuscripts, or other documents consulted during the dictation. Joseph afterward did not rearrange the sequence of a single sentence. So that, again, adding to the complexity and the challenge of him orally dictating this. After the loss of the 116 pages, Joseph continued from Mosiah, and then he returned to translating the small plates after he finished with Moroni. So 1st and 2nd Nephi, all the way to, the little books, Omni, Enos. That was all after Moroni was dictated, even though it's at the front of our Book of Mormon. Multiple scribes, including Martin Harris, Emma Smith, Reuben Hale, and Oliver Cowdery, all agreed that Joseph never paused to review even the previous page or sentence, and he didn't use notes, books, or other reference materials. And even Dan Vogel, who is a critic who doesn't believe that the Book of Mormon is of divine origin or inspired, admits that Smith's method of dictation did not allow for rewriting. It was more or less a stream of consciousness composition. And we'll get more into the critics' theories for how he could have naturally done it in the next episode. But this is what critics have to say. It comes from LDS Discussions on Joseph orally dictating the text of the Book of Mormon in under 85 days without any notes or manuscript. The Book of Mormon is not nearly as unique or impressive as the church wants to declare, and the timeline is not even remotely miraculous. Using basic math shows us that Joseph Smith could have dictated the Book of Mormon for about 3 hours a day and complete it in 85 days. Now, if it's closer to maybe the 57, 60 days, then that would be considerably longer, but we'll grant him, 3 or 4 hours a day for the sake of argument, which would then allow him plenty of time to take breaks, map out the next section of the book, refer back to the manuscript as they create it, and study the Bible to include portions in the text. From there, we can look at the text of the Book of Mormon itself and show exactly how Joseph Smith was able to cobble together sources both in the Bible and in his milieu to create the stories of the Book of Mormon. So the critics would probably argue that, even the Book of Mormon might appear complex, the less than 85 working days and orally dictating or translating, equivalent of 8 pages per day, is doable. And in between the dictation sessions, Joseph could have been taking breaks as they went to go skip rocks, or as he went for a walk. He could have been flushing out what happens next in the story. The possibility of maybe studying his Bible, referring back to the manuscript perhaps. And critics would also argue that when Lucy records Joseph telling stories about the former ancient inhabitants of the continent, Native Americans, the buildings, animals they rode on, their warfare, that this was him practicing the stories for the Book of Mormon, so that he probably already had some of the outline and the stories mapped out in his head. And yeah, he maybe had the story worked out, 6 years prior to the actual dictation. And we'll talk more about that in the next episode. But critics would agree with the time frame and also that there is no notes or manuscript used during the dictation process. Critics do recognize the enormity of the challenge for Joseph composing the Book of Mormon himself. Von Brody said, "Never having written a line of fiction, he, Joseph Smith, laid out for himself a task that would have given the most experienced novelist pause. But possibly because of this inexperience, he plunged into the story. These biographers are impressed by the intellectual challenges Joseph Smith would have encountered and do not question whether he had the ability to overcome them." Dan Vogel stated, "The Book of Mormon was a remarkable accomplishment for a farm boy." And Dan Vogel's theory, which we'll talk about more in the next episode, and I will be doing an interview with Dan Vogel, portrays the dictation of the Book of Mormon more or less as a stream of consciousness composition recited mostly impromptu without the aid of notes. So the critics acknowledge the challenge for Joseph Smith, a 23-year-old farm boy with no prior authorship experience, to dictate a text 588 pages in length without notes or manuscript, and agree that there wasn't editing or rewriting or restructuring of sentences, and it was mostly impromptu or maybe semi-extemporaneous, as William Davis hypothesizes. And again, we'll talk about that in the next episode. Early critics of Joseph Smith and Mormonism referred to Joseph Smith as ignorant, an ignoramus, and Alexander Campbell, who's the leader of the Campbellite movement, said of the authorship of the Book of Mormon, "For uniformity of style, there never was a book more evidently written by one set of fingers, nor more certainly conceived in one cranium, since the first book appeared in human language. I could swear this book was written by one man, and as Joseph is a very ignorant man, and is called the author on the title page, I cannot doubt for a single moment that he is the sole author and proprietor of it." Mark Twain referred to the Book of Mormon as chloroform in print, and if Joseph hadn't have used the phrase and it came to pass, the Book of Mormon wouldn't have been more than a pamphlet. While some early critics sort of denigrated the Book of Mormon, we're going to talk about actually that the Book of Mormon is quite a complex text and narrative, and that's why I think some early critics began to move away from Joseph Smith being the author to, the Solomon Spaulding manuscript, and he must have had another manuscript he was working from. But does the Book of Mormon, does it have any literary merit or complexity to it? Book of Mormon Central has to say that the Book of Mormon contains over 200 named characters, 150 named locations, multiple migrations, distinct cultures, 3 calendar systems, a system of weight and measures, complex source texts, genealogies, lineage histories, political histories, authentic legal cases, realistic battles, multiple literary genres, embedded flashbacks, brilliant doctrinal discourses, numerous fulfilled prophecies, and well over 1,000 proposed intertextual relationships and Hebrew literary elements. And amazingly, these features are all intricately woven together into a coherent narrative, which is essentially free from error. Okay, so there's quite a lot in that to unpack, but certainly there's a lot of complexity in the Book of Mormon, and we're going to discuss a few elements. One is the internal consistent geography. So the Book of Mormon has over 500 passages of geographic relevance scattered throughout its text, and yet virtually every city, land, body of water, hill, or region maintains a consistent spatial relationship with other geographical features. Tyler Griffin at the 2017 Fair Conference said, "References to geography in the book with stories that are often separated by hundreds of pages having to do with the same geographical locations, and somehow it just stays 100% consistent. The Book of Mormon is consistent. The Nephites always go down to Zarahemla and up to Nephi. It is very clear and consistent in the topography." Certainly, I think the geography of the Book of Mormon is a complex feature. If it's completely consistent and there's over 500 different geographical references to all the different cities and locations, there's no evidence that Joseph Smith had a written out map. Scholars have created different maps for the geography of the Book of Mormon. And it's pretty remarkable that Joseph was able to keep all those things straight, able to keep all those details straight with this map in his head. Doesn't make it historical, but certainly makes it more complex. Another complex feature is the currency system outlined in Alma 11. Book of Mormon Central states that we find a developed system of weight and measures. Not only does it have parallels to ancient Mesopotamia and Egyptian systems, but its units of exchange are surprisingly practical. Another example of consistency comes from the lengthy genealogical record found in the Book of Ether, where the kings are listed in reverse order as you go through the book. It lists about 30 kings at the beginning of Ether, and then it talks about each one in reverse order. Might skip a few, but trying to keep track of these various sets of plates through their transmission, through prophetic caretakers, and how they all are tied can be a formidable task. Yet careful analysis has shown that the source texts of the Book of Mormon have been masterfully abridged into a coherent and unified record. And also going back to the argument about the genealogy of the Jaredite kings, listing 30 and then talking about each one in reverse order, that really stretches the credulity of how good Joseph's memory would have to be to remember each of the names of those kings and then talk about them in reverse order. I know often critics will say that the reason Joseph didn't replicate the 116 pages is because he couldn't remember the names or the names of all the kings, so he named all the kings after Nephi. But in the Book of Ether, unless he was taking a peek at the manuscript, how was he able to remember the names of all those kings and then talk about them in reverse order? Certainly adding to the complexity of orally dictating this and keeping everything straight in his head. So we talked about in a couple episodes ago, archaeological evidence, the convergences and similarities between volcanic destruction in 3rd Nephi. Dan Peterson's article, Mounting Evidence for the Book of Mormon, he says, likewise, the account of the Great Destruction given in 3rd Nephi 8 finds remarkable parallels with what modern seismology and volcanology show about cataclysmic geological events, and with historical reports of such catastrophes. Yet Joseph Smith never saw a volcano, never experienced a significant earthquake, nor is it likely he had read any substantial literature on the subject. Okay, so let's talk about both complex but also ancient elements which appear to show up in the Book of Mormon. We're going to have a look at, are these things ancient elements, and certainly adds to the complexity of the text if there are things which align with ancient Israelite culture or Hebrew writing. So Dan Peterson in the article speaks of Jacob 5, the parable of the allegory of the olive tree, showing a clear knowledge of olive cultivation far beyond what Joseph Smith, growing up in the American Northeast, could have possessed, but is entirely consistent in impressive detail with what we learn from ancient manuals in olive cultivation. Now, critics would push back that the parable of the allegory of the olive tree is an ancient element in the Book of Mormon, and that Joseph Smith could have drew upon passages from the Bible, perhaps. LDS Discussions has to say there are two major biblical passages that provided structural material for this parable, and a number of shorter passages that supplied secondary ideas. The primary passages are Isaiah's parable of the vineyard, contained in Isaiah 5, 1-7, and Paul's discussion of the relationship of Israel to the Gentiles, in which he used the metaphor of an olive tree, that Joseph is borrowing KJV material from both Paul and Isaiah, arguing that this allegory, attributed to the ancient prophet Zenos, is likely Joseph just borrowing from the two different metaphors from Isaiah and Paul and then combining them both together. Blake Ostler, in his article, The Book of Mormon, a modern expansion of an ancient source, has to say about the allegory of the olive tree, the metaphor of a vineyard or olive orchard planted by the Lord that brings forth wild fruit when left unattended is an ancient Hebrew theme. Paul used it. Thus, Joseph Smith had access to both the theme and the concept of grafting in his Bible. It is impossible to determine, however, whether the source of Jacob 5 is Zenos, which Lehi would have shared with his contemporaries like Jeremiah, or Joseph Smith's inspired reading of the KJV, or both. So, the parable and the allegory of the olive tree in the Book of Mormon being consistent with ancient olive cultivation that ancient Israelite authors would have had awareness of, could be pointed to as this might be an ancient element. However, it's also indistinguishable from, because of the reference both in Isaiah and Paul, and Jacob 5 does seem does appear to be, you could say, a combination of both. And as Oster put it, I don't think you can argue that this is an ancient element per se, or a strong evidence of ancient origin coming from the prophet Xenos, because one could also make the same argument that Joseph Smith naturalistically could have taken the sources from the Bible and combining both metaphors. So it's maybe not an ancient element beyond Joseph Smith's awareness or access, but it certainly is a complex allegory. As Elder Callister argues, it is a doctrinally rich and complex allegory which he needs to map out to follow. And he says, are we to believe that Joseph Smith dictated at the top of his head without notes or manuscript to read from the parable of the olive tree? Another sort of ancient element, Richard Bushman argues, is politics in the Book of Mormon. Richard Bushman demonstrated that it is an anomaly on the political scene of 1830 and the politics in the Book of Mormon, and it is much closer in government structure and philosophy to ancient Israelite monarchy than American republicanism. Parallels in ancient Israel more accurately stand as precedents to the political institutions and culture in the Book of Mormon narrative. In terms of political philosophy, the Book of Mormon fits much more comfortably into the tradition of Israelite thought than it does the American context of Joseph Smith. Okay, another sort of ancient element is Asherah and the Tree of Life. So scholars have recently come to accept that in ancient Israelite religion, there was a belief in a divine mother goddess named Asherah, who is a consort of God, El, represented by the Tree of Life. This Tree of Life's wisdom symbolism is widespread throughout the ancient Near East. And while critics would say that Lehi's dream in the Book of Mormon is clearly Joseph Smith plagiarizing and taking off his own father's dream, who claimed to have a similar sort of dream with a tree and a rope, scholars would point to that Nephi envisioned seeing Mary, the mother of Jesus, or the mother of God, as it says in the 1830 edition, appears as an ancient Near East theme and motif, as the ancient Israelites saw Asherah as the consort of God, and that she was represented as the Tree of Life in the Israelite temple prior to Josiah's reforms. Michael Ash wrote this in a Deseret News article. He says, what young adult in Jacksonian America, modern America for that matter, would make a connection between a sacred tree, the Virgin Mary, and God's love? In Nephi and Lehi's day, however, the connection would have been obvious and obviously colored by their cultural background. Mary was a perfect mortal typification of Asherah. She was a virgin, fair, and the mother of the most joyous thing in the world. While Mary is not Asherah, it's easy to see how Nephi's culture would have prepared him to understand such an interpretation. But how did Joseph Smith know this in 1830? Methodist scholar Margaret Barker observed that both Nephi's vision and ancient Near Eastern traditions symbolized the tree as the heavenly mother. This revelation to Joseph Smith, she said, was the ancient mother symbolism, intact and almost certainly as it was known in 600 BCE. Ash concludes that this fact and the fact that Lehi and Nephi portrayed the spiritual meaning of that symbol much the same way other ancient cultures portrayed it demonstrates that the Book of Mormon is an ancient text, not an invention of the 19th century social milieu. Okay, and while I don't see Asherah and the Tree of Life as this shows that, Lehi's dream is ancient and not just Joseph Smith taking off his own father's dream, I think this also adds a bit more complexity to this and how of the Tree of Life account and vision isn't just a modern element, but there is some ancient antiquity and ancient Near Eastern traditions about Asherah. Asherah being the wife of God, a mother goddess, and being depicted as the Tree of Life. Another ancient element is ancient covenant renewal festivals and coronation rites in the Book of Mormon. King Benjamin's speech follows the essential pattern of the covenant renewal formula found in ancient Israelite and Hittite texts. Stephen D. Ricks has observed that King Benjamin's speech contains 6 elements of a covenant renewal formula that are found in various texts from the Old Testament, as well as in ancient Hittite treaties. According to Ricks, the ideal was that the new king take office before the death of the old one, and this transfer of power was connected with the ceremony in which the people make or renew their covenant with God. 6 elements include a preamble, or review of God's relation with Israel, terms of the covenant, formal witness, blessings and curses, reciting and depositing the covenant. Blick also concluded, thus in many ways, the ancient covenant renewal ceremony better explains King Benjamin's speech than merely a revival camp meeting. Nibley also recorded that King Benjamin's speech is a coronation rite, because his son Mosiah would then take over and reign as king. So another ancient element scholars have pointed to are prophetic lawsuits. So legal analysis of King Benjamin's speech indicates that it falls comfortably within the literary form known as prophetic lawsuit, as derived from various biblical texts. In passages of this type, writes legal scholar John Welch, the prophet accuses, indicts, or prosecutes the people as if he were bringing action against them in a court of law. Osler, in his article, states, Abinadi's accusations against the people of Noah and his prophetic diatribe against the wicked priests of Noah are excellent examples of prophetic lawsuits. Can those who view the Book of Mormon strictly as Joseph Smith's work contend that he was subconsciously a genius in comparative literature and truly concerned with Sinaitic covenant and Hebrew legal procedure, because forms are subtle patterns that are usually evident only through scholarly analysis? It is unlikely that the one unfamiliar with the content of the form would simply duplicate it randomly, and less likely that he or she would use it in the proper context. Hence, when we find ancient forms underlying the Book of Mormon text, it is reasonable to believe that Joseph Smith used an ancient source as he said he did. Okay, so while scholars have looked at the Book of Mormon, in the Bible, there are ancient covenant renewal festivals and prophetic lawsuits. Scholars have also been able to detect these forms appearing in the Book of Mormon, which Joseph Smith would not have been aware of. However, you could still say that maybe with Joseph Smith's familiarity with the Bible, he maybe unintentionally included those things into the Book of Mormon. But again, if not showing that the Book of Mormon is of ancient origin, it again adds to the complexity of the text which he orally dictated. Another interesting one is the execution of Zemnariah. John W. Welch and some of his students have discussed the executions of Laban and Zemnariah in terms of Jewish law. Regarding the execution of Zemnariah, leader of the band of Gadianton, Welch has discussed the concept of hanging in early Judaism and the symbolism of the felling tree as a warning to other potential wrongdoers. The reason Zemnariah was hanged rather than stoned, the more usual method of execution under the law of Moses, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Temple Scroll, calls for the execution of a spy who betrays his people to a foreign nation or causes evil against his people by hanging. His successor's execution by hanging is entirely in line with the early Jewish law. And Daniel Peterson writes, after Zemnariah's execution, the tree upon which he had been hanged was richly chopped down, just as ancient Jewish law required. Okay, so let's talk about what are supposed ancient Hebrew writing literary elements in the Book of Mormon, Chiasmus and Hebraisms. So chiasmus is a poetic and rhetorical form used by many languages. Chiasmus is a form of parallelism in which related or contrasting ideas are placed in juxtaposition for emphasis, such as A, B, C, D, C, B, A. There appears chiasmus in the Book of Mormon, and there are some examples of complex chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. Chiasmus also appears in the Hebrew Bible, and ancient Hebrew authors would have used this. So faithful scholars would point to this as evidence to support the Book of Mormon is of ancient origin because of this ancient Hebrew literary element. However, critics might push back, saying that the chiasmus also shows up in the Bible and other literary works in Joseph Smith's day. We see it in the Doctrine and Covenants and books like the Late War, so it's hardly evidence that the Book of Mormon is of ancient origin. Blake also has to say this on chiasmus, supporting the Book of Mormon being an ancient text, that such literary characteristics are not necessarily impossible to explain in terms of a 19th century context. Chiasmus can also be found in some 19th century works, including the Doctrine and Covenants. However, Farrer responds that small, trivial chiastic structures containing only a few elements might well arise through chance or religious rhetoric, especially when other elements within the text are not considered in the analysis. However, critics ignore numerous complex, subtle, and meaningful chiasmus when they assume that all of the Book of Mormon's inverted parallel structures are so simple. For example, the long and complex chiasmus in Alma 36 is unlikely to appear by chance, or Joseph Smith just making it up on the fly. Welch argues it is difficult to imagine a more paradigmatic or a more effective use of chiasmus than this. Alma 36 is worthy and formed to the best of any ancient chiastic writer. Such use of chiasmus is rather a conscious creation of an imaginative and mature artist. And I would have to agree that I don't think the presence of chiasmus itself, particularly if you can see it in the Bible and other literary works in that time, imitating the Bible, and you also see it in the Doctrine and Covenants, I don't think chiasmus itself is evidence or proof that the Book of Mormon is of ancient origin. However, Alma 36 and others are certainly complex chiasmus, supporting that this could have been an ancient chiastic structure, but also again just adding to the complexity and the difficulty for Joseph Smith to have orally dictated this himself. Certainly on the fly, you would have to believe that he had this very well composed, and it is very beautiful, poetic religious literature. It's pretty impressive. Another intriguing example of chiasmus occurs in Helaman 6:10. Here, the chiastic turning point rests on an equivalence between the word Lord and the royal name Zedekiah, name Jehovah or Yahweh, and that the ayah element in Zedekiah is the first portion of that same divine name. Also, this chiasmus works better in Hebrew than in English, which is an important and remarkable clue to the original language of the Book of Mormon. Scholars Boyd F. and W.F. Farrell Edwards in their analysis conclude about chiasmus that statistical analysis of the probability of whether a given chiastic structure was intentional or accidental in the Book of Mormon, they conclude that the likelihood is high that chiastic structure appeared by design in the Pentateuch and in the Book of Mormon. Our estimates do not support such a conclusion for the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Abraham. So while short chiasmus, you could argue, could just appear by chance in the Book of Mormon, the long and complex chiasmus in the Book of Mormon, such as Alma 36 and Helaman 6, appear to be much longer and much more complex than the chiasmus we would see in, for example, the Doctrine and Covenants. And it's certainly a complex poetic literature for Joseph Smith to have orally composed, again, without any notes he was working from. It appears it was a very intentionally designed chiasmus with Christ at the very center. So I'm not saying that this definitely shows it was written and authored by an ancient author trained in Hebrew and the structure of chiasmus, but it also adds to the challenge, and I find it hard to believe that Joseph Smith could have just naturally orally dictated this himself, unless he had it memorized and was able to recite it perfectly. And if he pulled that off, everyone was like, wow, like, bravo, that's pretty impressive.
I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
Also, another cool thing about Alma 36 is not just the chapter with the longest, most impressive chiasmus in the Book of Mormon, but also in Alma 36, verse 22, Lehi's words are not only quoted, but they're quoted verbatim from 1 Nephi, verse 8. And such exactness cannot be explained by thinking Joseph Smith turned to 1 Nephi and copied the words of Lehi from what Oliver Cowdery had already recorded from Joseph's dictation. Because, as we talked about at the start, 1 Nephi was not yet translated until long after Joseph Smith and Oliver were translating Alma 36. So the complexity of the Book of Mormon, not so much being an ancient element. So Alma is quoting a verse which is attributed to Lehi verbatim, but in the oral dictation, 1 Nephi hadn't been created yet. So Joseph Smith would have had to remember that verse and then insert it in 1 Nephi. Okay, well, what about Hebraisms? So a Hebraism is a way of speaking or writing that uses the grammatical or rhetorical styles of Hebrew. For example, if originally written in English, the Book of Mormon would speak about brass plates instead of plates of brass. So other examples of Hebraisms include rod of iron, or the cognitive accusative, such as dream to dream, the construct state, such as works of righteousness, and we know Lehi said, I've dreamed a dream or seen a vision. The use of the word and many times in a list instead of just a comma. The phrase, and it came to pass. And the first edition of the Book of Mormon contains several examples of a grammatical structure, not known in English, but common in Hebrew, the so-called if and conditional. Because we would say in English, if you do this, then this. But the Hebrew writers would say if and conditionals, and those appeared in the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. So scholar Mark Twain, mocking the overuse of and it came to pass in the Book of Mormon, the phrase is likely actually prominently used in the Book of Mormon as a manner typical of Hebrew writing. The phrase was found 1,200 times in the Hebrew Bible and translated into the KJV about 727 times, as the phrase is quite redundant. However, you could argue that the phrase and it came to pass could still be just Joseph Smith borrowing from the Bible. And critics would often say that a lot of these Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon would also appear in the King James Bible, and that people would have spoke and been familiar with Hebraisms, and that they can be found in other pseudo-religious books from the 19th century imitating King James English and speaking and writing in Hebraisms. Also, some faithful scholars or apologists might actually question if finding Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon, does this support the Book of Mormon being an ancient text? Does this come from the underlying ancient text written on the gold plates, or was this part of the translation and Joseph Smith imitating the King James Bible. LA's Truth Claim says when it comes to Hebraisms, we have two possible sources for Hebraisms: a faithful retention of the plate language and grammar, or two, the influence of the King James translation. Donald Parry has to say this about Hebraisms, that the Nephites took their knowledge of Hebrew with them. Because some form of Hebrew was used among the Nephites, the Book of Mormon reads like an ancient Hebrew book, even in its English translation, that it sometimes reflects biblical and idiomatic Hebrew rather than 19th century English. In 1 Nephi 1 verse 2, Nephi says, "Yeah, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians," arguing that for perhaps maybe there was some underlying Hebrew in the text and that making its way into the translation. However, would we expect the writing of the gold plates to have consisted of Hebrew being in the language of his father and the Egyptians? Because in Mormon 9, verse 32 to 33, Mormon, who is the editor and abridger of the gold plates from the other records, says in the characters which are called among us Reformed Egyptians that if our plates had been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew, but the Hebrew hath been altered by us also. So if Mormon's abridgment, the gold plates, actually says that it was written in the language of Reformed Egyptian, not Hebrew, does that then mean that could there have been Hebrew on the source text? Frank Garner has to say, "There's no easy way to separate plate text Hebraisms from Joseph Smith's ready familiarity with the King James Hebraisms. Most evidence supports a functional equivalent for vocabulary. Therefore, a successful search for Hebraisms must find some mechanism that preserves syntax, but not vocabulary." And Gardner would believe that the chiastic structures in the Book of Mormon is part of the underlying source text, but would lean more towards the Hebraisms being the King James translation of Joseph's imitating and translating in King James Bible language and vocabulary, including Hebraisms. However, Donald Parry would view the Hebraisms supporting the Book of Mormon having ancient Near Eastern antiquity and being the writing of ancient authors, being beyond Joseph's natural capabilities, education, and familiarity with the Bible couldn't have equipped him, being beyond Joseph's natural capabilities, and his education and familiarity with the Bible couldn't have equipped him to so well speak in Hebraisms. So yes, there are Hebraisms that appear in the Book of Mormon. It's whether or not is this coming from the underlying source text on the gold plates, or is this coming from Joseph Smith imitating the King James Bible, either through oral dictation, him composing it, or by translation? Some faithful scholars would view it as this is Hebrew writing making its way into the translation, while others argue that there wouldn't have been Hebrew on the gold plates because it says that it wasn't written in Hebrew but in Reformed Egyptian. So where could the Hebrew have been coming through then? I don't think we fully understand really what Reformed Egyptian is, what that language is. Was there Hebrew mingled in with it? Maybe. So it's very hard, in my view, to distinguish whether or not the Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon can be attributed to the ancient gold plates or coming from the King James Bible, which is very clear that is the language being imitated and drawn upon in the translation. So perhaps it could be the ancient author's writing containing Hebrew making its way through. But then Gardner's pointing out, like, should we expect Hebrew on the plates if it was written in Reformed Egyptian? So my thoughts, I'm not saying that it's definitely not an ancient element or that it definitely is. I think we should be a lot more cautious, and it's maybe not as strong an argument, because I think you could argue that the Hebraisms occurs as a result of Joseph imitating the King James Bible, or that the King James Bible is being used under a functional translation containing Hebraisms. Okay, so what about some ancient names in the Book of Mormon? So this is quite fascinating. So there are Hebrew, Egyptian, and classical names which appear in the Book of Mormon but not in the Bible. There are some unattested names unknown in the Bible which are found in the Book of Mormon. Sariah being an authentic ancient Hebrew female name, and Alma a male name. Other ancient Egyptian or Hebrew names include Nephi, Aha, Chemish, Abish, Pahoran, Panchi, Pachumeni, Sam, Josh, and Ammon. Other authentic Hebrew names include Jershon. For instance, it designates a place that was given to the people of anti-Nephi Lehi as a land for an inheritance. In Hebrew, Jershon means a place of inheritance. Joseph would not have known this in the late 1820s. The Book of Mormon states that Jesus shall be born of Mary at the land of Jerusalem. Critics have jumped on this, as we all know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. How could Joseph get that wrong? In ancient Near Eastern documents dating back to the 14th century BC, known as the Amarna Letters, refer to Bethlehem as part of the land of Jerusalem. So Joseph was totally vindicated. He was merely translating language common to the usage of the time. And we discussed this 2 episodes ago about the name Mulek. Stamp seal of a royal figure was found in the 1980s by archaeologists digging in Jerusalem. It's dated to the exact time of Zedekiah, and it's written in Paleo-Hebrew, and it calls the royal figure Malchiah, son of the king, which would have been Zedekiah as of that date. That one of the shortened Hebrew variants of this name would be Mulek. And also with the name Nahum in the Book of Mormon, being an altar which is found in Yemen, containing the consonants NHM, matching in the right location and dating to the right time in the Book of Mormon, and Nahum in Hebrew meaning to mourn, and the text saying that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn over Ishmael. Okay, so that sort of covers ancient elements in the Book of Mormon. I would recommend reading the book Echoes and Evidences for the Book of Mormon. I think maybe with some of them, I think it's maybe we can't definitely argue, okay, this is definitely an ancient element, but definitely there's some of them which appear to be, certainly seems to be things from ancient Israelite law or tradition or culture or Hebrew writing, which seems to be unaware to Joseph Smith, and certainly things which just add to the book's complexity. Okay, so let's talk a little about Joseph's education level, his intellect. Could he have naturally done it? Was he intelligent enough? So Joseph says in his history, I was merely instructed in reading and writing and the ground rules of arithmetic, which constituted my whole literary requirements. And many scholars point to Joseph Smith having a third grade equivalent education. His mother Lucy states that Joseph was less inclined to the perusal of books, and at age 18 that he had never read the Bible through in his life. Martin referred to Joseph as a poor writer, and David referred to him as illiterate. Emma wrote that Joseph Smith could neither write nor dictate a coherent letter at the time of the dictation of the Book of Mormon. Our critics, as well as Neville and Lucas, I've been reading their recent book on the translation of the Book of Mormon by means of the Urim and Thummim, and they argue that Joseph Smith in his 1829 letter, which he wrote to Oliver Cowdery, it wasn't actually that badly worded or incoherent, and perhaps Emma and others aren't employing an apologetic to downplay Joseph's intelligence. There's some poor grammar and spelling mistakes, but the grammar is also not great in the Book of Mormon. So maybe the family and friends were trying to downplay Joseph Smith's intelligence and that there's no way he could have created this or dictated this book. He was barely literate. So it appears that he could actually dictate and write a decent letter. Brian Hales in his article said Lucia's mother said that Joseph was less inclined to the perusal of books than any of the rest of our children. In the historical records, things are mixed. Pomeroy Talker also wrote that Joseph Smith was uneducated and ignorant. Erasmus Turner believed Joseph Smith possessed less than ordinary intellect. Emma's dad, Isaac, he says, I first became acquainted with Joseph Smith Jr. in November 1825. His appearance at that time was that of a careless young man, not very well educated. Similarly, John Gilbert, who typeset the Book of Mormon in 1830, remembered, we had a great deal of trouble with it, the Book of Mormon manuscript. It was not punctuated at all. They, Joseph Smith and Oliver, did not know anything about punctuation. When asked, was he, Joseph Smith, educated, he responded, oh, not at all then. There's also no evidence that Joseph visited local libraries, and Emma Smith, David Whitmer, and Lucy Mack Smith reported that his knowledge of the Bible was limited. We'll discuss in a few minutes how well Joseph's knowledge of the Bible might have been. So it appears both friends and foe, believers and non-believers, didn't believe Joseph was overly well educated. Not that he was dumb or some country yokel, but that appears to be people's view of Joseph. Book of Mormon Central says that he apparently read from the Bible with at least some diligence, attended Sunday school, participated in a debate club, and was possibly instructed by his parents and siblings who had better educational backgrounds. They weren't enough to overshadow Joseph's relative ignorance. I also don't think it's easy to precisely determine just how much education Joseph attained so that we can say conclusively. Book of Mormon Central states, summarizing on Joseph's education and intellect, no matter how many years or seasons Joseph Smith attended school, or how helpful his supplemental educational opportunities may have been, or how quick a learner he was, or how sharp his memory, or how creative his imagination, it doesn't change the fact that he and those around him, both friend and foe, considered him as being relatively unlearned at the time of the Book of Mormon's translation. These historical reports are consistent with the limited data available concerning his educational opportunities. They're also supported by textual manuscript analysis of his early writing. Together, the evidence strongly points to his having a limited education and only rudimentary literary abilities, when he translated the Book of Mormon in 1829. And maybe let's talk about, well, how well did Joseph know the Bible? Because there's a lot of the King James Bible in the Book of Mormon, both long quotations, you got the Isaiah chapters, Sermon on the Mount, New Testament passages, which we talked about in previous videos, but also just small phrases as well. So you have the quote from his mother saying that he wasn't as interested in the perusal of books, and people saying that he didn't actually know the Bible that well. However, he did say that he was entrusted and taught in the Christian religion by his parents. And also in his 1832 account of the first vision, he speaks of searching the scriptures diligently between the ages of 12 to 15 and going to revival camp meetings. And he certainly would have had a familiarity with the Bible, but just to what extent? Had he had long passages memorized? Was he some theologian? During the translation of the Book of Mormon, he was apparently surprised to learn that Jerusalem had walls. Vogel would think he was just, playing a con here, building confidence in them. Emma, Lucy, David Whitmer, Martin Harris did all believe that his knowledge of the Bible was limited, but is this again them employing in an apologetic to make Joseph more dumb, to make the Book of Mormon more miraculous? Okay, well, let's talk about, was there a Bible used in the translation? So it's undisputed that there are King James Bible passages in the Book of Mormon. It's not always word for word. Sometimes the italics are changed or things are added, things take away, but there's certainly a dependence on the King James Bible. And critics would say, certainly for the long chapters of Isaiah, there had to have been a King James Bible open that Joseph was reading from to his scribes, because it kind of stretches credulity that he could have memorized long chapters. He probably would have needed an eidetic memory, which we don't have evidence of that he did. The witnesses to the translation are unanimous that the Bible was not consulted during the translation of the Book of Mormon. Stan Spencer says, continuously removing his face from the hat to make use of a physical Bible would not have gone unnoticed by those who watched him translate. Given the long quotations of Old Testament Isaiah passages and New Testament chapters and small phrases, to conceive of Joseph Smith either memorizing these passages and phrases or consulting a Bible during the translation is ludicrous. Someone would have noticed that, yet no one reports a Bible. That's interesting that. So no witnesses state that a Bible was present or used. Yet there are long chapters of the King James Bible which appear in the Book of Mormon. Now, they might push back that maybe some of the smaller quotations and phrases, these things could have been part of Joseph Smith's language and vocabulary, things which he would have heard from both reading the Bible and attending revival camp meetings and hearing sermons. So I don't think it's necessarily ludicrous that some of the smaller quotations could have been memorized. So you can make the argument that some of these phrases Joseph Smith may have heard over and over and over in his milieu and was just able to orally dictate. Evidence Central says that Emma Smith reported that during the Book of Mormon translation, Joseph didn't know that Jerusalem was surrounded by walls, a more basic fact that someone should know about the Bible. If Joseph Smith didn't know this basic fact about Jerusalem, can we expect him to be plagiarizing from the King James Bible during the translation of the Book of Mormon? It seems that there is much evidence to suggest that Joseph Smith didn't become as familiar with the Bible as he would need to be in order for our critics' theories to be supported. They all require that Joseph be deeply familiar with the Bible, either memorizing long passages from it or consulting it frequently during the translation of the Book of Mormon, and that there is also no evidence that Joseph Smith had an eidetic memory. So Evidence Central is arguing that Joseph's knowledge of the Bible, according to his mother and Emma and other witnesses, was quite limited. It's highly unlikely that Joseph could have memorized or recited long passages. Therefore, critics state a Bible must have been consulted, but no witnesses state that the Bible was consulted during the translation, and that there's actually no evidence that Joseph owned a Bible during the Book of Mormon translation, although he maybe could have easily, accessed one in the Hales or the Whitmer's home. The amount of minor textual variations between the Book of Mormon's content and the quoted biblical chapters seems too excessive to easily suppose that Joseph was reading these passages off to a scribe. You also think if a Bible was being consulted, wouldn't have somebody been like, yo, Joseph, you're plagiarizing the Bible, what are you doing? Although there's still many questions about the nature of the translation. However, there's a third option that maybe the translation of the Book of Mormon and the biblical quotations was revealed in the translation instruments, or Gardner's theory that the meaning of the plate was given to Joseph's mind and then he rendered and clothed it in the language of the King James Bible translation. Perhaps viewing the quoting of the King James Bible being a functional translation, but that Joseph Smith couldn't have done it without the aid of the Holy Spirit and the gift and power of God. The article, Did the Young Joseph Study the Bible? This comes from Robert M. Bowman. So he kind of pushes back on Joseph's having limited knowledge of the Bible. I think he raises actually some good points. He argues that what Lucy seems to be saying is that while Joseph did not read the Bible widely, he did read it more deeply, and one may presume that this meditation and deep study focused on the Bible. Like many people, Joseph had not read through the Bible from cover to cover, but this does not mean he had not studied large portions of it intensely. The evidence from his mother rather suggests that he did. And actually, I can actually resonate with that, because whenever I was 14 years old and first gave my testimony, I was actually studying the scriptures quite intensely. I was reading a lot of passages and really becoming familiar with it, but I actually hadn't read it all the way through. So I think you don't necessarily have to be familiar with something to have read it all the way through. Despite Orson Pratt's claims of Joseph's unfamiliarity with the Bible, Smith affirms rather that he had intimate acquaintance with those of the different denominations. In any case, Joseph Smith claimed to become so familiar with the Bible, and especially the New Testament, as to be able to conclude before his first vision that none of the denominations of his day were built upon the gospel of Jesus Christ. We do not seem to have any testimonies directly attesting that Joseph Smith had memorized large portions of the Bible, but religiously serious men in his day commonly did so. Pomeroy Tucker claimed that Martin Harris could recite long Bible passages. Bowman argues, while we've no evidence that Joseph Smith naturally could recite the Bible, if he could do it naturally, then that would have undermined his claims of the Book of Mormon coming by inspiration. He argues that Joseph Smith could have reviewed certain passages from the Bible, perhaps before dictation, providing plausible possibilities for how the translation could have been done. So remember reading in Grant Palmer's book, he talks about section 4 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and it's made up of lots of different King James Bible citations interwoven very well together. And he was arguing that Joseph Smith was just fluent in the Bible and was just able to recite these things. Neville and Lucas also agree that Joseph studied the Bible deeply in his youth and would have been aware of the main doctrinal and theological issues, that he would have also maybe had access to oral and written sermons, and that he was instructed in the Christian religion by his parents. They say we're not suggesting that Joseph Smith was some precocious junior theologian. However, we believe the historical record shows that he was literate. He could read, even if his writing skills like penmanship, spelling, and grammar were unformed. He was exposed to, aware of, concerned with the religious issues and literature of his time, and he read the Bible seriously. We also know that he went to a debate club, and he was also described as a passable exhorter as well. So when it comes to how well did Joseph Smith know the Bible, I don't think we can really know for certain. I think it's a bit unsettled. Like, you have some of his family members and some of the eyewitnesses saying that he wasn't that familiar with the Bible, but you'll also have Joseph's own accounts that he was well instructed in the Christian religion, that he was studying and pondering the Bible, I think searching it quite deeply between the ages of 12 to 15. There's no doubt the Book of Mormon, there is a dependence on the King James Bible. You've got Old Testament passages, New Testament passages, little phrases scattered throughout. And is this because Joseph Smith is translating and he's rendering the meaning of the translation using King James Bible language, this being prompted by inspiration? Or could this have been done naturalistically from his own memory, recalling these passages which he had heard? To me, I think Joseph Smith actually probably was quite well acquainted with the Bible. I think looking at his history, I imagine he probably searched it diligently and that he was quite familiar with it as well, going to different churches, listening to sermons, attending revivals, and that he would have been quite well instructed in both in the Bible and the Christian religion and the theological issues of his day. And I can't really determine whether the fluent quotations of the Bible appearing in both Book of Mormon as Revelations is him doing it naturalistically, or if it's by inspiration. Because, as Latter-day Saints, we believe that the Holy Ghost could bring things to our remembrance. And there's times even, as a missionary, when teaching a lesson, where I felt like things were just being brought to my mind and I was being divinely guided, even though it was me remembering it. But in the moment, it felt like it was coming from, like, I was being inspired. So was it the same for Joseph? I think the difficulty comes that no witnesses say a Bible was used, but really I think Joseph's memory, unless he had like an eidetic memory, it could have memorized chapters of Isaiah. I don't see him just being able to orally dictate and recite long chapters of Isaiah by memory with his face in the hat. But critics would then say, well, a Bible had to have been consulted. However, if he is doing a divine translation, that could be an explanation for it. However, even if Joseph Smith was better educated than what maybe some of his family members are stating, even if he could write a coherent letter, and even if he was really familiar with the Bible, it still doesn't take away the complexity of the Book of Mormon, combining both the sermons, the Bible passages, the complex storyline, plot lines, the genealogies, eternal consistent geography. It's still a very complex book for a 23-year-old farm boy. And the difficulty as well of not just writing this because loads of people could write, very complex books, but orally dictating it, doing a creative dictation in 2 months. Brian Hale says that all good writers rethink, rearrange, and rewrite large portions of their prose, making important decisions about the best ways to focus, organize, develop, clarify, and emphasize your ideas. Creative dictation is more challenging than creative writing. The associated memory burden and the inability to revise the previous composed text are constraints that may explain why other authors in the past have evidently never chosen creative dictation as a way to compose lengthy volumes. And like a lot of people will say, like, well, the Book of Mormon, like, oh yeah, it seems like really complex. It's 1,000-year genealogical history, but then look at Harry Potter, look at Lord of the Rings. But they didn't orally dictate it in 2 months with their head in a hat. And I'm sure they had notes and they took their time. J.R.R. Tolkien had years to write it. I'm sure he had a map as well that he was able to refer to. So I think writing and oral dictation isn't quite the same thing. And the memory would have certainly been stretched trying to keep right all the characters, all the geography, all the different plot lines, keeping it all coherent and consistent. Theory speculates that in the years prior to 1828, Joseph was involved with multiple undocumented activities that preloaded this long-term memory with data, memorized parts of the King James Bible and multiple other books from which he could later recall parallel phrases. His visits to bookstores and libraries to view maps and encyclopedias provided information that was mentally stored. This would have also required Joseph to manifest a vigorous short-term memory, capable of rapidly transferring information, creating each phrase and paragraph in succession, without the need to resequence any sentences in the Book of Mormon. So most writing is really rewriting and redrafting until it is right. For my YouTube videos, I heavily research, and then I write, and then I script my videos, and then I either use slides, or at the minute I use a script to help me. The good old days, I would have just had quotes, and then I would have give commentary. But it would have been pretty hard or near enough impossible for me to keep everything in my head without notes or a script, something to prompt me. There's no way I would be able to just have it all come out. And I think the burden on Drew Smith's memory would have been quite intense, him doing an oral dictation, if we assume that he wasn't referring to notes or the manuscript as the witnesses say, particularly going back to all the complex features we talked about at the beginning of the video. Apologists would point to certain things supporting an authentic translation, that the manuscript agrees with the eyewitness testimonies of it being a dictated text, it being an intricate narrative, that Joseph was unaware of some of the content while translating, that there's no source materials, a rapid dictation with no revisions, a miraculous translation speed, interweaving timelines, profound teachings, and subtle literary complexity. So I'm going to read some final quotes just about Book of Mormon complexities. These come from some faithful scholars and also some non-believing scholars as well. Historian Daniel Walker Howe said this, so he's not a Latter-day Saint. He said, "True or not, the Book of Mormon is a powerful epic, written on a grand scale with a host of characters, a narrative of human struggle, conflict of divine intervention, a heroic good and atrocious evil, of prophecy, morality, and law. Its narrative structure is complex." He says that the Book of Mormon should rank among the greatest achievements of American literature. And again, it was a creative dictation in under 85 days without notes or manuscript. Melvin Thorne said it's too complex to have been written by Joseph Smith in the manner and in the amount of time described by witnesses. Indeed, it is too complex to have been written by Joseph Smith in the manner hypothesized by his enemies or critics. Ultimately, it appears to be too complex to have been written by Joseph or any of his contemporaries in the early 19th century, under any conceivable set of circumstances other than the one Joseph describes, the translation by miraculous means of an anciently authentic ancient document. Historian and literary scholar Grant Hardy offers a similar summary in his careful analysis of the text. Not only are there more than 1,000 years of history involving some of 200 named individuals, nearly 100 distinct places, but the narrative itself is presented as the work of 3 primary editors and historians, Nephi, Mormon, and Moroni. These figures in turn claim to have based their accounts on dozens of pre-existing records. The result is a complex mix that incorporates multiple genres, ranging from straightforward narration to inserted sermons and letters to scriptural commentary and poetry. It requires considerable patience to work out all the details of the chronology, geography, genealogy, and source records, but the Book of Mormon is remarkably consistent on all of this. Their chronology is handled virtually without glitches, despite several flashbacks and temporarily overlapping narratives. There are only 2 potential geographical discrepancies, and the narrators keep straight both the order and family connections, among the 26 Nephite record keepers and the 41 Jaredite kings. Can these types of complex features really be ascribed to Joseph Smith's creative literary talent in 1829? Daniel C. Peterson thinks not. The intricate structure and detailed complexity of the Book of Mormon, he argues, seems far better explained as the work of several ancient writers using various written sources over the space of centuries than exploding suddenly from the mind of a barely educated manual laborer on the American frontier. And a final quote, which is sort of going to be a segue, finishing off this video into the next video where we're going to look at authorship and naturalistic explanations for the Book of Mormon. Some may understandably doubt that the miraculous story of the Book of Mormon's translation. Skeptical readers have been hard-pressed to come up with an alternative explanation for its authorship and origins. This is largely because the available historical documentation overwhelmingly indicates that Joseph himself dictated the entire text to his scribes between the April 7th and June 30th, 1829. All efforts to confidently pin the text's authorship on others have come up empty-handed. Perhaps someone will someday provide a historically supportable alternative theory. Until that day, readers are left with only Joseph Smith himself, and a text that was almost undoubtedly beyond his natural ability to create, especially under the circumstances described by the witnesses. This situation invites belief in Joseph's repeated claim that he translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God, rather by his own literary talents. And in the next video, we are going to explore the different authorship theories for the Book of Mormon and some of the best naturalistic explanations. We're going to look at things like, Solomon Spalding manuscript, which have been pointed to in the past, the view of the Hebrews, automatic writing, was he just plagiarizing from the King James Bible and things in his milieu? And was he able to orally dictate it himself? And we'll look at maybe some specific critics' theories like Grant Palmer, Dan Vogel, William Davis. If you're more serious critics who, in my view, have the best explanations for the Book of Mormon, and we'll look at some of the apologetic arguments and responses to their theories. Okay, so let's summarize today's video. And again, I'm sorry that this video was really long, but I want to try to include as much information in it. So in summary, the Book of Mormon was dictated in less than 85 days, 588 pages. Most scholars would say 57 to 74 working days, no notes, manuscript, or book to read from. So an average of 8.5 days per day, which maybe could be done in a 3 to 4 hour oral dictation. I'll just state that it's quite miraculous. Critics say that that's actually quite doable. Talk about the Book of Mormon's complexity, such as the 1,000-year narrative history, different civilizations, wars, calendar systems, currency systems, the internal consistent geography, the genealogy of kings in the Book of Ether, listed and then spoken of in reverse order throughout the book. Many of these things add to the complexity of the narrative being orally dictated. Faithful scholars point to ancient elements in the Book of Mormon, such as ancient covenant renewal festivals, coronation ceremonies, prophetic lawsuits, Zemariah's execution and Jewish law, the political system among the Nephites resembling ancient Israelite politics. We discuss chiasmus and ancient names as well in the Book of Mormon, ancient Hebrew and Egyptian. The parable of the allegory of the olive tree and maybe Hebraisms could be disputed as being an ancient element, as you could say that this just came from Joseph's knowledge of the Bible. Most evidence points to Joseph not being very well educated. I think he could write and dictate a coherent letter. It appears that he could in the letter to Oliver Cowdery. Definitely don't think he was some scholar or a theological genius. However, I think some people did downplay his intelligence and also his knowledge of the Bible. It's quite clear to me that I think he did study the Bible. Whether or not he had parts of it memorized really well, I think he was certainly familiar with it, but I'm unsure whether he could recite long passages of it naturalistically or if it was by divine intervention or inspiration. Overall, the Book of Mormon appears to be very complex. Believers and unbelievers acknowledge the complexity of the book. And it's really a personal decision whether the complex elements in the Book of Mormon to be ancient elements and evidence that Joseph Smith could not have orally dictated this and made it up himself, and that it's beyond his natural abilities to creatively orally dictate and spontaneously without redrafting or rewriting. So is the Book of Mormon complex? I think it is. I think it definitely is. And in a creative or oral dictation, really, I think Joseph Smith would have had to have had the story really well mapped out in his head prior to oral dictation. Critics would say he'd been practicing for years prior. But again, we can't know. We can't get in Joseph's head. There do appear to me to seem to be some ancient elements in the Book of Mormon, which seem to align with the ancient world, and appear that they wouldn't have been known or aware of Joseph Smith. So it's whether or not they just appear by coincidence or not. To me, even if it's not historical or of ancient origin, authentic, divine, it is certainly a complex thing for someone to orally dictate 588 pages without notes or manuscript, keeping everything in line and consistent. William Davis referred to this as being America's longest oral performance in history. And that's something that needs to be taken into account. This is not an everyday thing. And I also think he would have needed some memory, particularly when it comes to the geography, all the names, the kings in the Book of Ether. So it's not just the creativity, but the memory that he would have needed to do a creative oral dictation. He would almost need an eidetic memory, which I don't know if there's any evidence to support that he did. And also for me, as I've just been rereading the Book of Mormon again, I'm in Alma, not getting to the war chapters. It has really opened my eyes to like, actually this book is really long and really complex, which you might wonder why so long and complex if he's a calm man just making it up, not a shorter book that's a lot less complex. So it doesn't prove the Book of Mormon is authentic, it is divine, it is historical. Certainly adds to the challenge for a 23-year-old farm boy to just orally dictate this himself. Even if he was better educated than what his family say, even if he could write a coherent letter, and even if he was more familiar with the Bible than what Emma or his mother want to let on, it still doesn't explain how he was just able to do it. I still see all of the complex features in the Book of Mormon as a monumental task for Joseph to keep straight through a creative oral dictation. And I think one could look at the complex elements or some of the ancient elements scholars point to as supporting the Book of Mormon being of ancient origin and it being a translation of an ancient text. To me, from a practical point of view, I do find it hard to imagine him able to pull this off with his face in a hat. And I'm actually thinking of trying to create my own narrative, comparable but much shorter to the Book of Mormon, religious, made-up narrative, and to see if I can actually pull it off and see how it goes. So I think overall the book's sheer complexity, the ancient elements that scholars point to, as well as Joseph Smith's education not being super high and not being a theologian or scholar of the Bible, even if he was more familiar with it, I think it should be taken into account, taken into consideration, and it is, I think, an argument in favor for the Book of Mormon's divine claims, and not just being a natural product of Joseph Smith. At least it raises the bar and makes the challenge for him orally dictating this book far greater. So that's all of today's video. We'll see you in the next video when we look at the authorship theories for the Book of Mormon. Like, share, and subscribe. See you very soon. Take care. Bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.